Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is chapter 22 of the American Pageant, titled The Ordeal of Reconstruction. If you don't know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. First is the freedmen. These are the newly freed slaves after the Civil War. After the 13th Amendment, they are free from slavery. There were nuances in the status of freedmen. Some rejected freedom, some were suspicious, and some were excited in their newfound liberation. Emancipation brought upon a new set of challenges for freedmen. So just because all these African Americans were freed from slavery, it doesn't mean that their lives suddenly became good. They're still obviously suffering from major setbacks from years of slavery, and these aren't just going to magically go away. Exodusters, these are freedmen from the deep south moving to Kansas, so they're trying to escape that racism by moving up north. It symbolizes freedmen taking advantage of their freedom to form cultural communities to support each other after emancipation. So all these slaves are coming around, they're scattered across different plantations in the south, and they're all trying to move up north to join each other and create communities that are positive towards the black community. Freedmen's Bureau, this is a welfare agency for emancipated slaves trying to get their lives on track. The Bureau was successful in supporting freedmen and women, especially in education in forms of reading and writing. Although the organization wasn't always perfect, it symbolized hope for emancipated slaves and therefore was resented by Southern white supremacists. So as all bureaus and other bureaucracies and organizations, there's some level of corruption and negativity throughout, but the majority of what they did was successful, and that of course was great for them and not good for the racists back down in the South. Andrew Johnson, vice president who took over for Lincoln, his inability to identify with any side of the political aisle combined with his stubbornness that prevented any understanding, he was quite possibly the worst possible politician to be in charge of Reconstruction. So Andrew Johnson was quite indecisive. He was not very powerful in any way. He didn't really like to get things done. So he was probably the worst person to be in charge of Reconstruction because he basically let the super radicals on both sides just kind of take control of Reconstruction, which made it obviously have a lot of conflict. 10% plan, a loyalty Reconstruction plan proposed by Lincoln. This was sort of the passive plan from the northern side. The bill was mild and simple to follow for the South, since only a small portion of the population had to pledge allegiance, so literally only 10% of the southern population had to pledge their allegiance to the Union. This made Republicans push more intense Reconstruction policies because they felt that this wasn't enough. And now that Lincoln is obviously dead, they can push a plan a lot more tougher than this. The Wade-Davis bill, a more radical Reconstruction bill demanding 50% allegiance. So just quick math, this was 5 times more heavy than the other bill. The bill offered much more safeguards against any Southern rejections as it protected emancipation and demanded more allegiance and loyalty from the populace. Its rejection by Lincoln revealed the interconflict with Republicans over Reconstruction. So obviously there's battles between Republicans who wanted to put more pressure on the South versus some who were just happy that the Union was restored and were just want mild pressure on the South. So this is obviously a battle that raged on during Reconstruction. Radical Republicans, a smaller faction of the Republican Party, they believed the South should be treated harshly in the Reconstruction period and that its institutions should be destroyed and replaced. They would obviously support more of that 50% plan. Sharecropping, freedmen work for a farmer in exchange for some of its production. This is a huge key term from that post-slavery era. This was a huge kind of idea that the South still kind of pushed racism even after the Civil War. So essentially, it returned freedmen to an essentially slavery-like system. They had to work for little to no gains and were once again subordinate to their master figures. The North began to question whether the Civil War efforts were in vain, which was partially true because of this, that even though slaves were free, this sharecropping system just once again put them at the bottom of the economic and social class. So even after the Civil War and emancipation, they really didn't advance much in society. The Pacific Railroad Act, Transcontinental Railroad Plan, proposed in 1862. It was not only an example of nationalized transportation and federal improvements, It symbolized a series of bills that Congress was able to pass that favored the North in the period of Southern secession. So the Transcontinental Railroad was obviously going to be better for the North because more goods could flow and they were an industrialized area. Congressional Reconstruction, the period of reintroducing the South to federal politics. So not only did they have to rebuild the South economically and socially, but they had to reintroduce them to the government, where this is kind of an underrated part of Reconstruction, I think. Northern Republicans, rightfully so, were against readmitting Southern delegates to federal politics because they felt that the South could gain more power because of slaves counting for more population strength. So there's definitely some fears upon readmitting Southern representation to the government that maybe the majority of the South would just kind of forget about the Civil War and just continue to vote for their Democrats, which were the majority, racist party. But it will take the coming years throughout Reconstruction to see how this would really play out. The 14th Amendment, a constitutional law giving citizenship and other civil rights to blacks while also stopping the South's political takeover. It was a sacred law to the future of the freedmen, and it was also hated by the South. Almost all secessionist states rejected the bill, but nevertheless it obviously passed. Basically, the 14th Amendment gave everyone the same constitutional rights so that the Bill of Rights was not only given federally, but also throughout any state. No state could abridge people's rights, and this was very important for those people living in the South, that the southern states could no longer take away the rights of their people. Charles Sumner / Thaddeus Stevens, radical Republican leaders in the Senate and House, they pushed past the simple theory of Reconstruction. They pushed for racial equality and the restriction of southern states. Although they gained strength, the modern Republicans were in the majority. So a lot of more radical Republicans sought total racial equality along with a lot more control over the South from the federal government. But this wasn't an idea that was going to fly back in this day, and obviously it never did. Reconstruction Act, a drastic Reconstruction bill that controlled the South both militarily and through law. The bill helped to increase requirements for readmission to the Union for southern states in order to protect rights for blacks, although its attempts at moderacy would prove to be in vain later on. So although the bill made some progress in requiring southern states to do more to be readmitted to the Union, it had to pull back and attempt to appease to the Republican moderates, and those attempts to be moderate didn't really work. The 15th Amendment, constitutional protection of the right to vote for freedmen. It safeguarded the right to vote even after a secessionist state was admitted into the Union, which satisfied radical Republicans' fears that southern states would return to old ways after joining the Union. So essentially, radical Republicans, and rightfully so, feared that once the southern states are readmitted, they would once again start restricting people's right to vote, and then of course all the racist Democrats would be in office. But now that everyone had the protection to vote, obviously the power of voting would prevent this from happening. But as we'll see later on, that the South went to as far as it could possibly go to restrict voting access. Ex parte Milligan, Supreme Court ruling against military power in courts. The rejection of rulings like this during the military Reconstruction period showed that Reconstruction was a unique period that required even sacred documents like the Constitution to be bent. So essentially, the military occupation from the federal government in the southern states was in no way really constitutional, but the Supreme Court really rejected to rule that way, and they just allowed it to happen, which really shows the kind of key moment that Reconstruction really was. Redeemers, Democratic sympathizers in southern governments. It ensured that reconstructed governments would return back to old southern democratic ways despite attempts by the North to control the formation of their new governments. So even though they tried their best to give black people the right to vote, they put more controls on the South during Reconstruction. There is a large part of the South that still held a lot of faith towards the Democrats, towards the Confederates, and toward that racist way of life, so that the South would still uphold this way, and that obviously materializes into Jim Crow. Women's Loyal League, women's abolitionist group. It helped to conjoin the abolitionist movement with the women's rights movement and led to important questions about the expansion of civil rights to women. So now that the Civil War was over and the emancipation abolitionist movement was kind of over, you could see how the women's rights movement started to take hold. The Union League political club, transformed by freedmen for black advocacy, it helped to educate and expand the importance of blacks in society, and they threw their support behind Republican candidates and other advocates for protection for black communities. So now that African Americans had their right to vote and they also were becoming more involved in the political scene, they obviously threw their support behind Republicans who were more sympathetic towards racial equality. Scalawags, derogatory term for Southern black sympathizers. It showed how Confederates treated not only the black population poorly, but also their own white population if they were sympathetic toward freedmen. Scalawags, derogatory term for Southern black sympathizers. It showed how Confederates treated not only the black population poorly, but also their own white population if they were sympathetic toward freedmen. So you can really see how there was a large population in the South that were basically would cast people who supported the North, people who supported racial equality, cast them as outsiders. Carpetbaggers, derogatory term for Northern people coming to the South. It showed an almost nativist-like sentiment that Southern people had against their Northern counterparts, and that they felt their culture could not be encroached upon by outsiders. So the South really kind of retained some sort of weird, like, sacred attachment to racism, and they didn't like anyone from the South being sympathetic toward the North. They didn't like anyone from the North coming down to the South. Ku Klux Klan, everyone knows what this is, the discriminatory organization against blacks. It became infused with Southern institutions and culture, which struck fear through blacks and black sympathizers by often resorting to violence. So not only did the KKK have a lot of physical power, where they would obviously use a lot of violence, but they had institutional political power throughout the South, and that became super influential. Force acts by the government to curtail KKK efforts. They had positive effects on reducing violence, but at this point the damage had already been done, as white supremacy lived on as a deeply rooted mission in the South. And this is really important because even after the Civil War, racism would live in America for obviously another 100 years until the 60s. Tenure of Office act requiring Senate to approve a president's removal of somebody from his cabinet. It gave more control to the radical Republican government over representation in government, and gave them grounds to impeach President Johnson. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.